Lecture 8, Form and Function. In general, form is the design of a thing as a whole, the configuration of all its parts. Poets who find or follow a set pattern adhere to what is called closed form. Kennedy and Joya cite W.B. Yeats, who held that a successful poem will come shut with a click, like a closing box. Thus, the poet who writes in closed form strives for a kind of perfection, seeking to perhaps lodge words so securely in place that no word can be budged without a worsening. But this perfection can be extremely difficult to achieve, and often the fixed requirements of certain forms force a competent poet to depart from a symmetrical pattern for the sake of meaning or clarity. As Robert Frost observed, there is satisfaction to be found in things not mechanically regular. We enjoy the straight crookedness of a good walking stick. Unlike closed forms, such as the sonnet, which requires a set rhyme scheme and 14 lines of iambic pentameter, open form has no set scheme. Open form is often referred to as free verse because it requires no regular meter, rhyme, or stanzaic pattern. Poets who write in open form usually seek no final click. Instead, they see the writing of a poem as a process rather than a quest for some kind of perfection or absolute. With the freedom to vary line lengths and play with the white space on a page, open form poets often discover the form as the poem develops. Older poetry utilized closed forms because they make the language more memorable. This was especially important in the days before writing became commonplace. The Greek epics, for instance, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, were transmitted orally and thus adhered to patterns with particular stresses in lines that were of even length. In the 1960s, there was a movement away from the rigidness of closed forms, and even today poets tend to favor poems that remain open. Yet closed forms are making a bit of a comeback. And even open forms often follow some kind of principal pattern, whether it is repetition or refrain, or the pauses made by the poet's breathing. But more on the patterns of open form later. Let's look at some specific elements of closed form. Blank verse is unrhymed iambic pentameter. Most of Shakespeare's plays are written in blank verse, as is this short poem from John Keats, written to his fiancée, if you can believe it. This living hand, now warm and capable of earnest grasping, would, if it were cold and in the icy silence of the tomb, so haunt thy days and chill thy dreaming nights that thou wouldst wish thine own heart dry of blood, so in my veins red life might stream again. And thou be conscience calmed. See, here it is. I hold it towards you. You may have already heard of the couplet, 2 lines, usually of equal length, that are typically rhymed. Look at this final couplet from Shakespeare's sonnet, "Let me not to the marriage of true minds." If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. This is known as a heroic couplet or closed couplet, which is 2 lines of rhymed iambic pentameter. Notice how the first line ends with a light pause. A comma may mark a light pause, or the line break alone may signal the light pause. Notice how the second line ends with a full stop. These are the features of the heroic couplet. As you might guess, a tercet is a group of 3 lines. If a tercet happens to be rhymed, it usually keeps to 1 rhyme sound, such as in this anonymous English children's jingle. Julius Caesar, the Roman geezer, squashed his wife with a lemon squeezer. Though this is a rather silly example, it does illustrate how rhyme scheme can force surprising and unpredictable rhymes. Part of what makes Dante's Divine Comedy divine is its masterful use of a form called terza rima. This form is made of tercets that interlock through the rhyme scheme ABA, BCB, CDC, DED, EFE, and so on. So too, Robert Frost's employs Terzurima in his poem, Acquainted with the Night. I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye. And further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night. In Frost's poem, we can very clearly see and hear the interlocking rhyme scheme at work in these tercets. But notice also the couplet at the end. Count the lines. There are 14. Is this also a sonnet? Let's look at the whole of Shakespeare's Sonnet 116, Let me not to the marriage of true minds. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. This is an example of an English sonnet, sometimes called a Shakespearean sonnet. The word sonnet originated from the Italian word sonetto, or little song, which owes its prestige to Petrarch, who lived from 1304 to 1374, long before Shakespeare's time. A sonnet is a fixed form, which is a type of closed form. A fixed form is a traditional verse form that requires certain predetermined elements of structure. For example, a stanza pattern, set meter, or predetermined line lengths. The fixed form requirements for an English sonnet include rhymes that cohere in 4 clusters: AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, GG. And of course, in this case, the meter is iambic pentameter. The English sonnet has 3 places where the process of thought is likely to turn in another direction. Within its form, a poet may pursue one idea throughout the 3 quatrains, quatrains being a group of 4 lines, and then end the poem with a surprise couplet. Let's take a look at another type of sonnet. See if you can hear the difference between the formal elements of Shakespeare's English sonnet and Edna St. Vincent Millay's Italian or Petrarchan sonnet. What lips my lips have kissed, and where and why I have forgotten, and what arms have lain under my head till morning, but the rain is full of ghosts tonight, that tap and sigh upon the glass and listen for reply. And in my heart there stirs a quiet pain for unremembered lads that not again will turn to me at midnight with a cry. Thus in the winter stands the lonely tree, nor knows what birds have vanished one by one, yet knows its boughs more silent than before. I cannot say what loves have come and gone. I only know that summer sang in me a little while, that in me sings no more. To help you out with the differences, here's a side-by-side comparison of the 2 types of sonnets. The English sonnet has 14 lines, made up of 3 quatrains and 1 couplet. It follows the rhyme scheme AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, GG. There are 3 places where procession of thought is likely to turn in another direction. The Italian sonnet, also 14 lines, has 2 quatrains that make what's called an octave, and this octave is followed by 1 sestet, which is simply a group of 6 lines. The rhyme scheme differs from the English sonnet in that the octave follows the rhyme scheme A-B-B-A, A-B-B-A. The sestet may vary a rhyme scheme, so there are several examples here. We might find a CD, 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 or a CDE, CDE, or a CD, CC, DC, or, as in Malay's poem, CDE, DCE. The octave states a problem, and the sestet states a kind of solution to that problem. In both cases, the forms move the thought of the poem along. Oscar Wilde once said that a cynic is a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. A pointed and rather terse statement such as this is known in poetry as an epigram. Often witty, an epigram jibes with an unexpected stinger in the final line or even the final word. Here's a good one from E. E. Cummings about a politician. A politician is an arse upon which everyone has sat except a man. So too, 3 particular French forms for poetry are still popular with English poets today because they demand elaborate echoing that involves the repetition of either full words or whole lines of verse. These forms are the triolet, the villanelle, and the sestina. The triolet is a short lyric in which the 2 opening lines are repeated according to a set pattern. It's often used for light verse, but the example I will read you here by Robert Bridges demonstrates how the form can carry a heavier load. Triolet. When first we met, we did not guess that love would prove so hard a master. Of more than common friendliness, when first we met, we did not guess. Who could foretell this sore distress, this irretrievable disaster, when first we met? We did not guess that love would prove so hard a master. I have posted links in the Week 5 module to both Dylan Thomas's famous villanelle, Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night, and Elizabeth Bishop's sestina, appropriately titled Sestina. I'll read Thomas's poem to conclude this discussion of closed form, but I strongly recommend that you study these poems and figure out their patterns. How does a villanelle work? How does a sestina work? See if you can hear some of the formal elements at work in Thomas's villanelle. Do not go gentle into that good night. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men, who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men, near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay, rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Some poets, like our old boy Robert Frost, do not care for open form, which, as I mentioned earlier, is also known as free verse. Frost once said, writing free verse is like playing tennis with the net down. And yet, many other poets have demonstrated that free verse can still be tightly written and elevate language to a particular degree of importance, as poetry has always done. Consider this poem Ancient Stairway from Denis Levertov. Footsteps like water hollow the broad curves of stone, ascending, descending century by century. Who can say if the last to climb these stairs will be journeying downward or upward? This poem, while not employing a fixed form, still demonstrates careful attention to line length. Lines are broken deliberately to emphasize an image or action. The poem uses a kind of repetition to echo a certain idea, ascending, descending, downward, or upward. And the poem is unified by the central figure of speech, the metaphor of the ancient stairway. Thus, despite its open form, there is no question that this is a poem. It's important to note that with free verse or open form, line breaks are often determined by the poet's or speaker's breath. White space is used deliberately to indicate where longer or shorter pauses or breaths should be acknowledged when reading the poem from the page. This practice is known as projective verse. So in the case of projective verse, a poet might indicate the breath on the page by using a lot of white space or just a little bit of white space. There might be slight or deep indentations of lines, depending on whether a short or long pause is intended. Now, there is much debate about whether or not prose poetry is actually poetry. Indeed, the name itself is an oxymoron, much like the term jumbo shrimp. Yet a skilled poet who chooses to use the paragraph or prose form rather than line breaks still pays attention to sound, even rhythm, as well as image and metaphor. I invite you to think about whether or not prose poetry is poetry by reading The Colonel by Caroline Forché. Her poem can be found on pages 214 to 215 in an introduction to poetry, and I have posted a link to her poem in the Week 5 module. Is The Colonel a poem? Does it employ enough poetic technique to be called one? Or is it merely short prose? At last, we have concrete poetry, such as the Eiffel Tower poem that you recently viewed. This type of poetry is a visual poetry composed exclusively for the page, in which a picture or image is made of printed letters and words. As you work on the final poetry writing assignment and prepare for the midterm exam, you should look at how poets are using form to shape the meanings of their poems, even if the poems do not adhere to a fixed form. We will discuss these particular elements of poetry in a bit more detail during this week's discussion forum as we explicate Wallace Stevens' poem, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird.